Before I introduce our speaker, I first want to take a moment to acknowledge that wherever you're calling in from, which may or may not be Seattle, you are on Indigenous land. And at MOHAI, we are on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and all Coast Salish people, who were forcefully removed but whose endurance we honor today. And as part of our mission to be a catalyst in the community, we support calls for federal recognition of the Duwamish tribe, and we encourage you to learn more about the Duwamish people by visiting the Duwamish Longhouse, which is in West Seattle and is actually going to be opening a new exhibit soon, Spirit Returns, in the next, beginning next month. So highly recommend doing that. And now I would like to introduce, very exciting, our Executive Director, Leonard Garfield, who is both the Executive Director of MOHAI and a Seattle historian, as you will hear tonight. Previously, he served as Director of the King County Office of Cultural Resources, now known as For Culture, and as Washington State Historic Preservation Manager and State Architectural Historian, where he directed the Washington National Register of Historic Places. So please give a round of applause, which we cannot hear, but we'll imagine, for Leonard Garfield.
Thank you, Rachel. And I can't figure out where my picture is. Oh, I've already goofed it up.
Oh, no, you're doing great. Now you're back. All right, well, I will get out of the way. Yes, okay. I can see you, and now I'm going to give over the stage.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel and Kelsey, and good evening, everyone. It's great to have you all joining us. I am here at the newly named McQuaid-MOHAI Resource Center, which is our treasure house of 4 million artifacts and objects and incredible remnants of Seattle history that we preserve so carefully and then bring out onto display at the museum. I'm a white guy, middle-aged, and I'm sitting in a conference room. So just delighted to have you here. And as I go through some of the images this evening, if you are challenged visually with seeing the images and want a little more detail, be sure to let Rachel or Kelsey or Julianne know, and we'll make sure that you get some of that information. I liked the suggestions that everybody had on their favorite innovation. I like that grunge one. That's really cool. And that reminds me, there's an anniversary of Nevermind coming up imminently, or maybe it just happened. And clearly there's some very cool innovations in Seattle history. But I'm going to talk a little more theoretically about the notion of innovation in the Northwest and how that reflects some of the themes that have shaped us as a place over time. Let me start with well, I'm having a little bit of trouble moving the slideshow forward. There we go. So I'm calling the presentation In the Spirit of Da Vinci. And I was inspired by that title because in the exhibit we currently have at MOHAI, Da Vinci Inventions, among the many, many fantastic and sometimes fantastical innovations that sprung from the mind of Leonardo, there's actually an epigram on the wall of the gallery that is attributed supposedly to the Renaissance man himself. And it says something like, once you have tasted flight, you will walk the earth with eyes turned skyward, for there you have been and there you long to return. Looking up and looking out, the essential human and cultural impulse to look around us and imagine beyond the present. In so many ways, that was the spirit of Da Vinci and the spirit of the Renaissance. But it also, in so many ways, is the spirit of Seattle, a sense of resourcefulness and inventiveness that is very much a part of our region's history. And that's what I'd like to share with you this evening. In fact, the term innovation, meaning the application of novel solutions to real-world challenges, actually came into common usage in the English language hundreds of years after Leonardo, around the time of the mid-19th century, at the very time that seismic disruptions here in the Northwest, marked by the clash and confluence of many cultures, were happening. It was a time in our region when innovations precipitated many changes that continue to shape us today. The resourceful adaptation of technology in the Northwest stretches back through time immemorial and plays out over an immutable landscape. And as we reflect on the spirit of Leonardo's inventions, which were based on such close observation of nature, our exploration of the innovative spirit in our own place must begin with the first peoples, the Coast Salish, whose endurance and creativity is above all based on a deep connection between human culture and the natural world. And here you see two Coast Salish women at a summer camp in traditional clothing with a mat hut in front of a cedar canoe. The resourceful use of cedar, as just one example, was integrated into every aspect of life. Cedar bark was used to create watertight baskets and fashioned into waterproof clothing, highly efficient fusions of form and function that continue to be echoed in design work today. Cedar construction technologies were among the most flexible ever conceived, composed of linear post and beam modules, economic in their use of material, and flexible in their arrangements of interior space. Cedar was key to innovations in Coast Salish maritime technology, with Salish carvers crafting ocean-going canoes of highly sophisticated design. Coast Salish people were innovative environmental managers as well, and on a very large scale, shaping the world through their ecological knowledge. Each year, for example, prairies were burned to renew the bulbs that grew there and to keep the forests at bay. Fishing weirs, complex and intricate assemblages of branches, reeds, planks, and other materials, were built to channel and harvest fish runs, capturing returning salmon along rivers and streams, and along the margins of coastal estuaries where they worked in tandem with the ebb and flow of tides. And here you see a weir from the Wilkes Expedition in the mid-19th century on the Chehalis River. These innovations were ancient. Examples in our region have actually been dated back thousands of years, but they were continuously adapted, as you see here, and they were key to the resilience of Coast Salish culture even into the modern era. Native technologies reflected an environmental understanding that was lacking in Western market cultures, where the commodification of resources led to significant depletion and loss. Fish weirs, for example, allowed Native people to closely monitor salmon fisheries, shaping their harvest in response to annual variations in run size and the demands of upriver communities. They were often cooperatively built and maintained, and they were regulated by task leaders who distributed the harvest to the community. And while weirs were designed to maximize the number of fish, the Coast Salish left enough salmon to spawn, a model of sustainability that was impacted by intensive non-Indigenous fishing and urban industrialization, which would reduce the abundance of salmon in the Puget Sound by over 90% between 1850 and the end of the 20th century. Now, the Coast Salish also maintained complex and highly innovative patterns of trade and communication that connected cultural groups in networks that extended as far north as Alaska and east to the Rockies, and by the turn of the 19th century, increasingly intersected with French, English, and American traders. Amid these evolving commercial relations, an innovative trade language grew among native and non-native speakers to facilitate regional commerce. It's a linguistic adaptation worth looking at because it speaks to how innovation in a changing world works. The so-called Chinook trade language, of which you see a few examples here, was composed of only several hundred words and phrases, an amalgam of Lushootseed, English, French, Algonquin, a Scots vernacular, and even trace amounts of Hawaiian, all languages spoken in the Northwest marketplace at mid-19th century. Because the lexicon was small, it was easy to learn, and the syntax was simple, allowing commerce to proceed among a diverse workforce sharing a common patois. The Chinook language spread broadly in the mid-19th century, from the lower Columbia River through Oregon and Washington, British Columbia, and as far north as the Yukon Territory. By the 1860s and 70s, the Chinook jargon became the workplace parlance in multi-ethnic work environments, including timber mills, canneries, and agricultural settings like this Puget Sound hops farm, where native and non-native people jointly inhabited the cash economy and the natural world. A few words from Chinook remain in use today. Mucky muck, for example, meaning a high-level person, but few people recognize their innovative roots. And key to this is, like most successful innovations, Chinook, of course, was not new. It was a novel enhancement that arose from a collaboration among diverse cultures, an innovative response whose impacts went far beyond simply expediting a trade. Into that world of cross-cultural commerce, permanent United States settlers arrived in the Puget Sound area in the early 1850s, about the time the term innovation came into common use. They were part of a larger historical movement that urbanized the American West. With little understanding of indigenous patterns of land use and stewardship, the first United States settlers in what is now Seattle envisioned an economic nexus where American railroads from the East would connect with steamships bound for Asia, a sense of the Pacific Rim a century before that would become a commercial buzzword. The Denny Party were familiar with rudimentary advances in transportation. They read Scientific American, and they were uniformly young. David Denny, in this photograph, was only 19 when he arrived in 1851 and sent word to his family to come join him at once. There was room, he famously said, for 1,000. But if the Denny Party had a vision, their survival was made possible only because of the extraordinary leadership of Chief Seattle and the Duwamish people, and Seattle's remarkable facilitation of cross-cultural politics and economic interactions. It is indeed a story of innovative cultural relations, an innovative racial hybrid world, as historian David Berge calls it, that was essential to their success. Within the first months of arriving, with the aid and cooperation of the Duwamish, the Denny Party took soundings for a deep harbor suitable for a transoceanic port and shifted their settlement to that very spot in what is now downtown Seattle. And it was here that they bet big on new technology, investing right away in an improbable startup, a steam-powered sawmill, a technology so new it was found nowhere else on the Puget Sound, but one that instantly launched the region into international commerce and brought an infusion of cash, commodities, and people. And you see here the map by Lieutenant Phelps, where in the very center of this small community of Seattle is Yesler's house, Yesler's mill, and sawdust. The man behind these technological breakthroughs was this formidable newcomer, a fellow named Henry Yesler, an itinerant entrepreneur from Ohio who came to the West with 1,000 good ideas. And grizzled though he appears at the age of 42, it was his experience in brand new technologies that the young townspeople prized. In what might be called the region's first ever public-private partnership, the Seattle community enticed Yesler with offers of manpower, access to timber, and a place on the waterfront. Yesler worked with manufacturers in Ohio and Maryland, studied these patents that have appeared in Scientific American, and within the year was harvesting the surrounding timberlands, sending logs down a skid road to a waterfront mill, and loading the ships that came almost at once. By the end of 1853, Yesler's mill was running full steam, and Yesler employed nearly everyone in town, indigenous and non-indigenous alike. It was a diverse workforce from the beginning, and in those early years included people like Bill Gross, a free Black man, who at a time when American Blacks were mostly enslaved, found work on Yesler's mill as a cook, a restaurateur, a hotelier, and later as an independent real estate developer. If the mill's technology, let me go back one. If the mill's technology was mostly from Eastern machine shops, the diverse workforce that worked at the mill added an older Northwest innovation that made the mill truly successful. Native mill workers introduced a lubricant made from fish oil that was robust, readily available, and cheap. And from March 28, 1853, when Yesler's mill sawed its first plank, ships loaded with pilings sailed for San Francisco and within a few years as far as South America, even Australia. This was innovation from the ground up. And it was indeed the single initiative that set Seattle apart from its Puget Sound rivals at mid-century. And the technologies that sprang from that early industrial base were significant. Seattle became a center of innovations in extractive methods, as we see in these photographs of removing timber from the forest, milling technology, shipping innovations. The threshold to enter the timber economy was also easily crossed. Within a few decades, there were nearly 200 firms dealing in some form of timber technology in King County alone, including what would soon be recognized as the largest shingle mills in the world. The cascade of innovations would last well into the 20th century, with innovations in machine manufacturing, truck assembly, and logging railroad design coming from this early incipient industrial growth in Seattle. Now, if the collaborations that spurred Yesler's Mill were the first in the city's industrial age, they were a prescient indication of the kinds of collaborations that would be seen repeatedly in Seattle history, a pattern that formed a point of civic pride for city boosters. When ships laden with gold arrived unexpectedly on Seattle's waterfront in the summer of 1897, heralding the last great gold rush of the era, Seattle as a community saw it as a chance to match opportunity with innovation. In this case, it was 30-year-old Erasmus Brainerd who ceaselessly telegraphed news across the globe in the 1890s that if you wanted to get rich, you had to come to Seattle before you headed north to the gold fields of the Yukon. 19-year-old Jim Casey raced through town on a bicycle, a favorite innovative high tech of its day, delivering packages instantly to departing ships, an early mobile service that grew to become UPS. Joshua Green, in his early 20s, launched a fleet of steamships to haul prospectors and provisions north. That last innovation begat a new industry, the shipping industry. In 1904, the city's biggest shipyard, the Moran Brothers, flush with gold rush success, sought to build the biggest thing that Seattle had ever seen, the USS Nebraska, a steel-hulled battleship. The job was huge, but the consequences potentially bigger, putting Seattle shipbuilding on equal footing with the great shipyards of the East Coast. It was yet another public-private partnership at the most fundamental level. So determined was the Moran to win the bid, and so enthusiastic was Seattle for that success, that Moran turned to his fellow citizens to join the crusade. And remarkably, a subscription from citizens raised $100,000, the critical edge enabling Moran to successfully win the contract. 5,000 men like those you see in the picture worked in the yard, honing new skills in industrial production, metal production, and exploring new technologies. And on October 7th, 1904, as 50,000 citizens looked on, the battleship was launched into Elliott Bay. Within the next few years, tens of thousands were employed in the city's shipyards. Hundreds of ships were built using this new innovative technology, 96 in 1918 alone, and trade with Asia exploded. Seattle had confidently entered the League of Industrial Cities. The early 20th century was indeed a heady time of innovation in every arena, though each innovation came complete with its own set of new challenges and consequences that often threatened the very natural resources and the very people that had stewarded the land for so long. Consider, for example, that city engineers, supported by business leaders, undertook a bold regrading of the city's hills and the filling of tide flats to accommodate commercial expansion, but created economic displacement and environmental degradation in its wake, including the loss of important intertidal areas of the Duwamish Estuary and the Seattle waterfront. A cutting-edge hydroelectric system, both public and private, was built to light a city and, even more importantly, fuel its industry and urban growth, but with dire effects on salmon runs. And in 1916, private and public funds built a shipping canal that would link the Pacific Ocean with the fresh waters of the Northwest. But the lowering of Lake Washington to accomplish this had massive ecological and human impacts, reducing the lake surface by 7%, and disrupting the migration patterns of adult and juvenile salmon. Innovations, Seattle learned, never came with complete solutions or very often with easy answers. Amidst this explosion of activity, in the summer of 1909, the city welcomed visitors from around the world to experience firsthand the innovations of the age at the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition on the grounds of the young University of Washington. It was a cacophony of creativity, showcasing everything from the wood products of Northwest Mills to the first ever wireless transmission of sound, a prototype cell phone and radio that was designed by Seattleite William Dublier that he patented a decade before the radio revolution. Also at the fair were two men who would change the course of Northwest industry. One looking to the sky, like Leonardo, one to the seas. The North Pacific, as we know, is blessed with one of the prized salmon fisheries of the world. But preparing fish for the consumer market at the turn of the century was labor-intensive, slow, and not conducive for easy shipment or quick sale. And the cannery workforce was comprised of highly skilled Chinese butchers, but their numbers were limited by racist exclusionary immigration policies, and their endurance to deal with the fish was limited, of course, by human stamina. To the proto-industrialists of Seattle, this was a situation primed for an innovative solution. Enter Seattle inventor Edmund Smith. Smith was a garage tinkerer whose Seattle workshop put him in contact with the West Coast canneries of his day. One fish packer asked Smith to devise a mechanized butchering process that would introduce the principle of mass production to the salmon canning industry, and one that would be fast enough to take advantage of the short-lived salmon harvest season. Smith embraced the challenge and spent several years visiting canneries to study the manual work of the butchers, exploring the methods of their cleaning and gutting, and engineering a mechanical solution that would replicate that human activity, but without the human requirements for pay or health or politics. Eventually, Smith's machine achieved speeds of up to 50 times faster than the human workforce, butchering 50 fish a minute. And when it was first introduced in a Bellingham cannery, production was exponentially increased. The innovation worked, and the industry was changed. Suddenly, salmon runs were fished at even greater numbers. Production scaled up enormously, prices tumbled, and canned salmon suddenly went from a seasonal delicacy to a mass market consumable for the American table. Smith named his invention the iron chink, reflecting racist attitudes about the workforce and a belief that a machine could really indeed replace humans. But once again, innovation came with consequences. In this case, displaced Chinese and native workers, and the trauma of newly recruited laborers from the Philippines, as well as the overfishing of salmon that was precipitated by this mechanization. Also at the AYP was Bill Boeing. He was much younger than he is in this photograph as a middle-aged man, because at the time he was still a young man. Like the Seattle pioneers of the mid-19th century, he had set out on his own innovative course in the timber industry at a young age, then reinvented himself in his mid-20s when he followed a passion into the novel world of aviation. Boeing used local resources to leverage his ambitious vision, the forest products of the region's timber industry for the fuselage, skilled craftspeople like the boat builder George Pocock or Lake Union sailmakers, the intellectual power of the university where he endowed the first wind tunnel to test the aeronautical properties of his plane. But he also went beyond Seattle to fuel his vision. He won US government contracts, first for the military and later for mail delivery, and he engaged the talents of a young Chinese engineer, Wang Su, who became Boeing's chief engineer, the very first, in 1916, a technological wizard who in later life helped launch the Chinese aviation industry. It was military contracts that launched Boeing and airmail contracts that sustained those early post-war years with projects like the B-1. But it was World War II that catapulted Boeing to the front ranks of American industry. Boeing's technology for the B-17 and the B-29, with some 5,000 discrete components, created an enormous industrial powerhouse. And soon the city attracted newcomers from across the nation to work in Boeing war plants, Black and white, women as well as men, people who had rarely been on the workshop floor. And here you see a photograph of a group of Black Rosie the Riveters in World War II. These thousands of workers, highly skilled engineers, unskilled laborers, formed a massive workforce designing and building the most complex technology of the age. And after the war, the Boeing workforce initiated its way to commercial success at the dawn of the new jet age. The key moment of that post-war transition may best be seen with this plane, the 707, and on a day in the 1950s on the shores of Lake Washington, where the community gathered by the thousands to watch its launch. As the crowd looked up, Boeing test pilot and engineer Tex Johnston maneuvered the prototype of the 707, a plane which would revolutionize jet travel, and watched with pride as he took the plane into an unexpected and thoroughly thrilling barrel roll, a spectacular display of personal daring that spoke directly to the innovative spirit and the engineering accomplishments of post-war Seattle. Those Boeing engineers and machinists would soon follow the success of the 707 with the 727, the 737, and its many successors up to the present day, continually pushing the envelope as they rolled from Renton and Seattle and Everett plants. Those assembly structures by themselves, some of the most innovative workplaces, unequaled in size anywhere in the world. Boeing's work with NASA in the 1960s undergirded the Apollo space mission and led to innovations in far beyond commercial jets into missiles, satellite technology, material science, and much more. That innovation engine in Seattle was powered, of course, not just locally, but by enormous and unprecedented investment of federal support, and not just at Boeing. Public investment in the Western power grid, anchored by the Grand Coulee Dam and other massive hydro projects, created a canvas for growth for firms like Boeing in cities like Seattle. And federal largesse supported UW's explosive growth after the war, supporting a significant amount of research and investment in medical technology, including the early adoption of innovative kidney stents and dialysis delivery systems innovated by Belding Scribner and Fred Swenson, the adoption of early ultrasound by advanced testing laboratories in the UW, the heart defibrillator of Dr. Edmark in physio control that was adapted for the Medic One system that made Seattle reputedly the safest place to live in the 1970s. Other innovations of the age that were inspired by work from the UW and elsewhere range from Fluke meters to McCaw cellular advances. Each of these innovations was also contributing to the emerging sense that Seattle was a city of engineers that was able to tackle any problem. That community of problem solvers was naturally drawn to civic as well as technologic innovation. Perhaps the most innovative example of civic power coming together in an innovative way was the cleanup of Lake Washington. And so there's Medic One, reflecting on that. For a region that long prized its natural beauty and depended on its natural resources, the Puget Sound region by the post-war years was in bad shape. A combination of industrial effluent, agricultural runoff, and rapid population growth had overburdened the existing inadequate water treatment facilities and turned Lake Washington, as well as Lake Union, into a veritable sewage pond, one that risked not just community health, but actually the fundamental quality of life. By the mid-1950s, the lake was headed toward irreversible environmental degradation. The problem was exacerbated, and some would say created, by a distressing lack of regional cooperation, jurisdictional turf battles, political antagonism between city and suburb, a perceived cultural divide between the east and west sides. All of those made any solution seem impossible. Clearly, the problem needed some fresh thinking and some new thinkers. The new thinking came from people who were not the usual suspects, not elected officials or others in the political class. Instead, they were volunteers, civically minded residents from a variety of neighborhoods and political backgrounds, united in the belief that common sense action and a willingness to embrace new ideas was critical. Led by a Bellevue resident, Jim Ellis, the community volunteers suggested a dramatic civic innovation, devising an entirely new regional government that would rise above partisan politics, rise above jurisdictional clashes, and commit to actionable innovations to clean up the lake. And here you can see the political poster that was used to inspire that action. The new government was known as Metro, and it developed a regional water treatment system that dealt with runoff, pollution control, and water quality monitoring for the entire region. And it achieved its measurable goals at a pace that outstripped promises or expectations. Within a decade, Lake Washington was returned to acceptable levels just a few years after the new government was created, and nearly fully restored by the mid-1970s. And here you can see the West Point sewage plant. For the first time in American history, an environmental remediation was accomplished without either court order or as the result of an immediate catastrophe. And the speed of the reversal was a reminder that innovative solutions often have a kind of built-in accelerator that can far outstrip old methods weighted down by sclerosis. The list of other post-war civic innovations is equally impressive. The cleanup of Lake Washington, beginning in the 1950s, was preceded by the construction of floating bridges in the 1940s, engineering marvels of their day. It was followed by a World's Fair and the growth of an arts infrastructure in the 1960s, and the preservation of Pioneer Square and Pike Place Market in the 1970s. Even the geography of the Pacific Northwest and the urban center's easy access to mountains and waters fostered some of the world's most inventive initiatives in outdoor wear and gear. From Eddie Bauer's early adoption of Gore-Tex to the innovative cooperative purchasing system created by REI, founded by Mary and Lloyd Anderson. And there you see Lloyd on a mountaintop in the Cascades. And protecting that environment, which had been so despoiled by some of the very innovations we've discussed, called for deeper understanding of the enduring innovations of the Salish people. Tribal leaders like Bernie Whitebear and tribal environmental agencies worked tirelessly to engineer the degraded habitat back to functional systems capable of supporting fish and other natural resources. Landscape scale restoration efforts, they called for a combination of political activism and scientific innovations, and that impacted thousands of miles of Northwest salmon habitat. By the mid-1970s, Seattle had begun to win a series of Most Livable awards that would continue to be bestowed through the remainder of the century. And as the city attracted an increasing stream of entrepreneurs, the community began to see itself reflected in the image that Seattle invented: educated, technologically sophisticated, civically engaged, and often young. When Bill Gates and Paul Allen returned to their boyhood homes as young men in 1980, as a place conducive to innovate because it was a place conducive to live, it was a kind of apotheosis of Seattle recasting itself as the cities whose highest values were innovation and livability. In 1985, Microsoft went public. With their vision of a computer on every desk, Gates and Allen changed the workplace and the home. Soon Microsoft, as with Boeing before it and the timber industry before that, spurred new technologies and spun off new companies. Beyond Windows and Office and Outlook, there were soon Expedia and Zillow, Xbox and cloud computing, and the enormous philanthropic undertakings that could invest in far-reaching innovations across a range of literally existential human challenges, from global health to economic empowerment in the third world. The revolution in the digital world that was happening in Seattle was perhaps best personified by the founding in 1996 of Amazon. It was in part Seattle's culture of innovation that attracted Jeff Bezos as he drove across the country with a business plan and a dream, creating e-commerce at a massive scale, digitizing content for online distribution, creating a virtual world of applications through the cloud. Amazon became a global innovation machine that was creatively disrupting everything that was. If the Northwest was a cultural crossroads as the term innovation was beginning to gain traction in the 1850s, it has remained a global crossroads ever since, drawing people in, sending ideas and products out. The region has built deep capacity in several knowledge sectors, an infrastructure of significant educational and philanthropic institutions, a tradition of applying technology to drive issues of livability and social innovation, as well as commercial application. One last example from a few years ago. In response to the Ebola pandemic, the product designers of Intellectual Ventures, which was a spin-off of Microsoft, teamed up with the global health nonprofit PATH, the philanthropic Gates Foundation, and even engineers at Boeing to create a portable device that would transport life-saving vaccines that final mile to some of the most remote communities in Africa. It was simple, but life-saving, an innovation that has never seemed more timely. And it's that sense of possibility to take risks, to learn from failure, to build a community worth living in and passing on to our children and grandchildren that is the Seattle spirit of innovation. And here I've outlined some of the characteristics that I find repeating themselves in Seattle's best innovations: locally collaborative, globally connected, a flat and porous social structure, educated, civically engaged, a strong philanthropic sector, a focus on livability, and an understanding of environmental stewardship. If that sense of possibility to take risks, is the Seattle spirit of innovation, I want to close with a quote that I love sharing because I think it captures the Seattle spirit of innovation. Jim Ellis said it well during those heady days of cleaning up Lake Washington, which we just were talking about. Working with the best engineers, the most progressive politicians, the most critically engaged community groups, he realized that we did not need to wait to save our environment or conquer pandemics or to build the infrastructure of a great city. We could do it ourselves and we could do it now. As Jim wrote, we have the talent and the resources to create the city we want in our own time. And that, I think, is the Seattle spirit of innovation. And with that, I am very anxious to hear your thoughts, share ideas, and answer any questions if you might have some.
Thank you so much, Leonard. It's given me so many different things to think about. And as you just said, we would love to hear from you. Please put any of your questions in the chat box as we keep thinking about what makes the city innovative. I love that quote from Jim Ellis. Definitely an innovator to think about, and I think a good inspiration for how we can each continue to be part of that legacy. So I have to ask Leonard, as we were talking about before we started this meeting, about the invention that was on the first slide.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
See, there's a little bit of false advertising going on at MOHAI. I have to confess, I take full responsibility. You know, I was thinking about all the great innovations that we have at MOHAI, and one is this amazing machine. It's a bit of a Rube Goldberg contraption that was developed in the Puyallup Valley at the turn of the century when our region was the hops growing center of the world. We put Germany to shame. We were so successful. Unfortunately, hops are very sensitive to lice and other infestations. And that machine that you saw in the advertisement was a wonderful invention that was inspired by Ezra Meeker, among other people, to spray the hops fields to try to fight those nasty lice in order to save the hops crop. Hops was a major economic driver in the Puget Sound area. It was up there with coal and with timber for a few very short years. And a little bit like the, the tulip boom back in whenever, it kind of came and went. But interestingly, the hops growing is still an important industry in Washington State. It's just moved further further east. It's more in the Yakima Valley now. And people come out from Germany to study our hops fields. You can still go into Puyallup. Wow. Absolutely. You can go to Puyallup and see the drying kilns. Hops have to be dried in these wonderful architectural structures in which they were dried from the late 19th century. You can still see and visit. So a little bit about hops. But as I was thinking about the broad range of innovation, I was trying to focus a little bit more on the broader social and economic patterns and a little bit less on the specific innovations.
Yes. Which I appreciate. Okay, we've got some good questions here. Well, the first one is related to our fairs and asking when Seattle might host its third World Fair. And I want to add to that, what do you think would be the centerpiece? You know, we've got the first one where we're really looking to the connection to Alaska and the gateway to the north. Yeah. And then the second one where it's all about Jetson type space future. So curious what you would think would be the theme that would tie it together, and maybe some of the innovations that would be part of that.
Well, I get to see who asks the questions, and Margaret Rose is kind of an architectural whiz, and she probably has a very specific idea. So I might defer to her on that one. But what do you think? It seems like existentially we're thinking about equity. We're thinking about the environment. We're thinking about our digital world and how we preserve our democracy within that. And I think we're thinking about space and where this race of creatures, humans, go. Do we leave this planet, and what does that mean? So I think those are some of the themes, and it would be nice if the next World Fair was less commercially focused and more, focused on these big ideas.
That would be good. Yeah, I was really taken that you included civics on your list of innovations. I think we don't always think of that, because often inventions are things that can be patented and sold. And many of the things that we lift up are different companies. So I'm curious what drew you to adding that to the list.
Well, that's a great question. Speaking of patents, we were the area that per capita had the greatest number of patents for many years in the early 20th century. We were kind of a virtual patent machine going on here. There was so much inventiveness. But innovations really are tested by their longevity. That's why it's so important to look at Salish culture. The innovations are adapted really thousands of years ago and evolved over time. But they were the ones that really proved to be sustaining life in a meaningful and successful way. The innovations of more recent years that will succeed will be those that actually will shape our lives in a better, sustainable way. And that includes how we organize ourselves. Because if we are not well organized politically, socially, and culturally, we can't be successful economically or scientifically. And democracy is at the very heart of that. What so inspires me about the metro example, and I have a little postscript on that, but what inspires me about it is people decided they weren't going to stand for the sort of entrenched antagonisms of the political process. They were going to find common ground because they were smart. We're smart people. We can do things. We can figure things out if we just take some of the artificial political barriers away. And ultimately, democracy allows us to create the platform for doing that. Now, I should hasten to add on the Lake Washington cleanup, there were some pretty significant environmental issues that weren't addressed, that had to do with social inequality, that had to do with damage to indigenous communities in other parts of, that were tributary to Lake Washington. There are some very, very good books. And Emerald City by Matt Klingel is the one I would highly recommend to really understand how to unpack the cleanup of Lake Washington, because on the level of political action, it was highly innovative, as it was environmentally in terms of remediation. But the longer term consequences weren't fully addressed in terms of social equity and impacts on specific groups. And the next round of innovation is never entirely new. It's always building and improving. We need to build and improve in that way as well.
That's a really good point, and one that I hope we see people take up handily, maybe even people on this call, connected to this thought around civics and politics and intractable problems sometimes. We have a question about how could we use innovations regarding problems like homelessness and growth in the way that we're growing in the city, and as you're saying, has having disproportionate impacts on different people and leading to a lot of civic pain.
That's where I think history is so helpful. Rachel, I think you and I have done a couple of programs on the Great Depression. And the last time we faced a homelessness crisis of this magnitude probably was in the 1930s, where there were vast displaced communities who really had been marginalized in every possible way. And there were some incredibly innovative ways of organizing and addressing that problem. So I can't give the answer in a thumbnail because it'll take all night. But there are very good academic studies of Hooverville from the 1930s, specifically the Hoovervilles that were located in Seattle, that formed systems that connected the community of homeless people, or people without housing is perhaps a better way to put it, with city government. And they found points of trust, in points of support where they could address those issues and yet still give autonomy to those people who were struggling with that issue. And it was a remarkably successful solution because it helped get people back into housing, but it also created safety for those who were without housing for that period of time. So I would encourage us to look historically for some inspirations about how to innovate into the future. But, again, to that question, it's one of these things where if smart people get in the room together and leave some of the more divisive politics at the door, we can find solutions. I'm totally confident about that. I don't know if Leonardo really took flight. I have a feeling he did not. So the little epigram at the beginning strikes me, Rachel, you help me on this, strikes me as maybe not being something he actually said, but I think it's true. When you have that sense of being able to look beyond and look above some of the intractable situations we face, the solutions often are there. It just takes all those things we talked about and then the persistence and the willingness to take risks, to fail, and to learn from that and try again. I think those are the solutions.
Yeah. That finding that will to take those risks, I feel like, is everything and so hard. Speaking about risk, I was taking with all the unintended consequences that came with some of the earlier inventions. I'm curious what you see as potential unintended consequences for innovations we're seeing today.
Well, it's for the ones that are happening today. Oh, that's interesting. Well, I'd have to have a crystal ball to figure those out. But I will tell you one thing. When I was working on, I spent a lot of time thinking about innovation historically within the historic context, because it's one of our themes that we love to focus on at MOHAI. We're very proud of the Bezos Center for Innovation, which we have, and our collection of innovations, which is so important. But the more I think about our innovations, what I realize is that innovation has consequences, and some of them are magnificent and wonderful, and some of them are frightening and disheartening. And we need to look at innovations with really open eyes to understand the balance of those things, because we don't really know what the unintended consequences will be because they're unintended. But if we look at them with open eyes and we are inclusive, and we think about the value of having many voices at the table and many solutions to consider, I think we can avoid some of those unintended consequences. But you know what? We'll never avoid them completely. And we have to be willing to say, that's not how we really want it. Let's try again, or let's innovate a little bit more.
Yeah, maybe that's one of the things we need to add to our city character is flexibility and adaptability.
Yeah.
And being able to admit when we're wrong, which is
such
a hard thing
I need to add that to my list there. Bring back that list.
Those are my additions, Leonard.
We'll add that. I like that. And that list, by the way, folks, is infinitely expandable. Please add to it. Let me know what you think your key characteristic or a critical characteristic of innovation is, because we actually have worked with a lot of people who are extremely innovative. They're on the leading edge of their various industries and fields, as well as with lots of school kids. And almost all the time we ask people, how do you define innovation? How do you capture that special magic in a bottle, and what would the ingredients be? And almost always, somewhere in the answer, collaboration and a willingness to learn from mistakes is almost always part of the answer.
As it should be. Speaking of MOHAI, we have another question, which is, how will MOHAI recognize and preserve the innovation and technology of our future?
That's a great question. That, to me, is one of the most important things that MOHAI needs to do. And we need everybody's support to do it. We are, history is so interesting because I think when we look backwards, we think history moves slowly. And yet at the moment that we live through it, it seems like history is moving so fast. So probably the answer is somewhere between. But we do know that this community is evolving. New people are coming in, new ideas are emerging, entirely new sectors of human thought and industry are arising. And we need to preserve those because therein lie the clues and the lessons that will help us shape the future. So MOHAI has a program of collecting historical artifacts, even from the most present, the most recent history, like today. I'm trying to understand them, completing oral histories with those who are innovators in their fields, and really trying to hold on to that and make sure that we have the permanent record of where we've been. I mean, think how wonderful it would be to go back to some point in the early 19th century when the world here in the Northwest was changing. These great innovations of course, Salish people were meeting these adventurous people who had no understanding of the world they were coming into, and to understand how, when they were successful, how they successfully worked together. And when they were not successful, what lessons we can learn from their experiences. We piece that together now through very limited written records and archaeological records. But in our own day, we have the chance to really capture history. What motivated somebody? What did they learn? What made them feel proud? How did the community respond? And capturing that history is probably the most important thing MOHAI can do for us, because there's so many lessons to learn, but even more especially for the generations coming up, because their future will be dependent on understanding better what we are doing right and not so right now.
Wow. Yes, it's a hard one. And we all need your help to help us identify. So you, those of you here, are part of our city, helping us figure out what will those be for the future, and how to keep dreaming big, and constantly inquiring as to what innovation really means and expanding our view of that, which I so appreciated, Leonard, how many different types of innovations that your talk comprised to really be expansive as we're thinking about that concept.
You know, the part I left out entirely there, Rachel, I mean, I left out so many things.
What did you leave out?
Things, but what I left out, and you mentioned at the beginning, and one of our guests logging in mentioned it, music, dance, cultural expression, architecture, art. We have a wonderful tour right now in MOHAI. It's a digital tour of the sculpture of George Tsutakawa, who was such an important artist, not just regionally, but really globally. And, you know, speaking of the spirit, I mean, that's why we have the tour, because he's in the spirit of Leonardo. He's observing nature. He's merging cultural patterns that are very diverse and exciting. He's finding new ways of expressing things. And he's creating some functional things along the way. You know, the delight of water within an urban environment is functionally very important. So I would love to have a program where we talk more about innovations in art and how they reflect the broader patterns of innovation. But one of our questions had to do with, do we think Seattle's isolation contribute to its success at innovation? And every time you delve into this topic, Mark, the same answer, you know, the answer comes up that the answer is yes, because everybody, I think, views this. Now, we're being a little bit parochial here, because this is sort of the last stop right before you end up in the ocean. But looking at it from another perspective, it's the first stop going somewhere else, or it's in the center of everything if you have that particular worldview. But certainly the sense of isolation and remoteness for United States settlers who came here in the mid-19th and the early 20th century, that clearly was a precipitator of innovation. The notion that there was a kind of flat hierarchy, that the traditions of more older established areas wasn't in play, that the freedom to create, the freedom to reinvent yourself, and this is true of the Western United States in general, but that certainly was a characteristic that is very strongly reflected in those who, in terms of the United States activity here in Western Washington. You know, one of the most interesting things, I did some work on the early papers of the Denny Party, who essentially came across the Oregon Trail in 1851. There is not a word in their diaries about regretting leaving their home in Illinois. I don't think they disliked Illinois that much, but they were looking to the future, and being far away from the past, physically far away, I think probably was an element of the attitude and the willingness to embrace change that they brought with them.
Absolutely.
And I see, go ahead.
Oh,
Rachel.
I was just going to say, I was thinking about how to tie it to this, because we just got a question about Seattle's isolation and how it contributed to its success and innovation, which is interesting because I often don't think of Seattle as isolated. I do see us often as this hub. But I'm curious your take on this.
Well, I was actually responding to Mark's question.
Oh, got you.
See, I cheated, Rachel. I looked at the questions first, but let me say that's what I was sort of saying. I mean, it's a little bit parochial for us to think of us as isolated, because that's how those of us who weren't born here, we think this is really isolated because maybe we came from London or Shanghai or New York or whatever, but you were born here. So you think it's probably the center of the universe. But, it's all relative. We're all a point on the globe. Every point is equally remote. Every point is equally connected. But I think to Mark's point, those who came out here in their minds did think of this as being remote. What they did not understand is it was one of the richest, most vibrant, most successful, innovative cultural communities in world history, because Salish people are amazing. That culture is amazing. That is our culture that we have benefited from, as from all the other cultures that have come here. So very much the center of the world. What was particularly interesting in the early 19th century, though, is that other people were discovering the Northwest. So you had Spanish explorers, you had English fur traders, you had American, so-called United States fur traders, you had Russians, you had Japanese sailors who ended up here, and you had Hawaiian sailors as well. So it was a very much a cross-cultural environment that was at an inflection point of change. And the innovations from Coast Salish culture help support continuity. The innovations that Western European, United States culture brought in help precipitate dramatic economic change. But it was quite a fertile clash and confluence of cultures. In that sense, it wasn't remote at all. But for those who came from the Eastern United States, they had in their brain the notion that they were first and they were alone. Of course, they weren't true in either regard, but it did inspire a certain kind of response.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's fascinating, all the different ways you can view a place based on what your background is and how you're seeing it. And I really think, as you're saying, the fertile nature of the heterogeneity of many different cultures and many different backgrounds coming to one place, and the tension that often causes, but also the dynamism of being able to build off of each other and have ideas butting up against each other to create something new.
Exactly. I think we had a question, if we have time for one more, about school groups and stuff, and I wasn't sure if we answered that one.
Kelsey, I think it was answered directly.
It was answered
but
directly.
If there's anything else you want to say,
well, I just wanted to say the museum is open, and if you haven't had a chance to see Vinci Inventions, I think you're going to love it. I love it, and I had no idea that Da Vinci, then, in his brain, he didn't actually build anything, right? But in his incredibly fertile mind and imagination, he so closely observed nature and so deeply understood humans that he, as well as basic physical principles, that he came up with some amazing inventions. And Italian craftsmen, drawing from his notebooks and his codices, have recreated these. There are about 50 of them. They are from the, incredibly large, flying objects that remarkably are prescient designs in relation to the actual commercial flight, and all the way down to small mechanical instruments that reflect very basic physical principles. It's really a remarkable show, a lot of fun. So if you haven't seen it, come in and see it. It's just great. And we're open 7 days a week, and that includes for families, including young people. We're not doing formal school groups, and that's we're just kind of going to go a little bit slow. But I think in the answer we have we're going to start doing those later this fall with self-guided tours and stuff. But our real hands-on stuff, our class-based in-museum activities, we're going to hold off on those for a little while. We want to make sure that everybody's really safe. And I think that's the other thing I probably should say when you come to MOHAI. Make sure you bring your mask, because we're going to require that. And then starting on October 25th, along with every other museum in King County, we're going to ask that you have proof of vaccination. So we're just going to make sure everybody gets to enjoy the museum in a really safe way.
We'll add to us of being innovative and engaged. Come into in person. That some of those are continuing as well. Our trunks that you can always rent. So lots of great educational offer for K-12. One last question for you. which is from Moorish, thank you, which is, Leonard, when you think of your amazing
Looks like we might have lost Rachel here.
Okay, she had one last question. I wasn't sure if it was me or her, so I turned myself off. Because my big secret is if you turn your video off, it seems like all problems go away.
Sometimes it works, definitely. Yes, we did have just one last question here. So when you're thinking about your amazing leadership of MOHAI, what are you most proud of? This is a one from Maureen Frisch.
Oh, Maureen. Well, I'm very proud to have worked with incredible people like you, Kelsey, and like Maureen, and like Julianne, who's just popped up on the screen. I think that what we all can be proud of as a community is that I think in Seattle, we really do understand that the history we share and build together is so valuable. And making sure that there is a place to tell that and to tell it fully in all its diversity and all its challenges, in all its wonderment is something very, very important. And I'm so proud that the community has come together to make MOHAI a strong institution with a strong future. And I just look forward to doing a lot more in sharing these incredible stories with this remarkable community that we all are lucky enough to call home.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Leonard. This was such a wonderful talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Really gave me so much to think about here. So we are going to end our program here, but we would love to invite you to the museum. We are going to actually be hosting our next program on October 9th. From 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. It's going to be a Saturday in-person program. It's called The Root of It All, Family, Culture, and Community. This is a wonderful program that we're doing in collaboration with many different partners, including the Black Heritage Society of Washington State, the Black Genealogy Research Group, University of Washington Special Collections. So it's going to be a really fantastic day where you can build your own family tree, do research on your own neighborhood history, and we'll get help from archivists and genealogists and other historians. But if you've learned something new today and you enjoy the work we do, please consider making a gift and becoming a member to support future programs and help sustain the museum beyond the impact of the pandemic closure. And with that, thank you, everyone. We'll be sending out a recording of the program later, so we hope you enjoy it another time. Thanks so much, Leonard. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thanks, everyone. Good night.